Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Hallie Rexer, and I am a part of the development team at ASU College of Law. We're so excited to welcome you all today to this session to be able to engage in this discussion around a topic that is clearly top of mind for many of us across the country. This event is the first in our Future 50 Conversation Salon series. ASU Law is launching an impactful new initiative, the Future 50. This year marks both the suffrage centennial and ASU Law's 50th anniversary. So together we're celebrating 50 years of influential women in law and ushering in the next 50 more to come. Just a quick housekeeping item before we get started. During the presentation, please remain on mute. Feel free to utilize the chat function throughout the presentation. And at the end, we will open it up for questions. You can use your camera or continue to use the chat function. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker for the presentation. Angela M. Banks is an immigration and citizenship expert whose research focuses on membership and belonging in democratic societies. Her scholarship has appeared or is forthcoming in leading American law review journals such as the Emory Law Journal, the William and Mary Law Review, and Brooklyn Law Review. Prior to joining the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law faculty, Professor Banks was a professor of law at William and Mary School of Law. She has also served as the Reginald F. Lewis Fellow for law teaching at Harvard Law School, a legal advisor to Judge Gabriel Kirk McDonald at the Iran United States Claims Tribunal, an associate at William Cutler and Pickering in Washington, D.C., and as a law clerk for Judge Carlos F. Lucero of the U.S. Court of Appeals in the 10th Circuit. She received a BA in sociology from Spelman College, summa cum laude, and a master's of letters in sociology from Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar. Professor Banks is a 2000 graduate of Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor for the Harvard Law Review and the Harvard International Law Journal. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor Banks.
Wait. And I think, okay, there. I was trying to talk and it told me I was on mute. So sorry about that. And I was pressing the space bar and good old PowerPoint took me through my slides. So good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm excited about the conversation that we're gonna have tonight. And I want to thank Hallie and the rest of the development team for putting this talk together. I think it's a really great idea, wonderful sort of 50th anniversary and 100 years to celebrate. And so I'm excited to be a part of it. So as Hallie said, I teach and write about immigration, and my focus is on questions regarding membership and belonging in democratic societies. So in other words, I like to write and think about how do we understand who belongs in our national communities and who doesn't belong. Tonight, I'm going to use the COVID-19 pandemic as a lens to think sort of more broadly about different models of membership that are operating within American society. And those two models that I'm going to focus on are the status model and the participation model. Each model reflects a different approach to identifying the people within our national communities who are viewed as the people who should receive the most robust set of rights, responsibilities, and opportunities. So in order to do that, I am going to walk us through sort of begin by giving you a snapshot of unauthorized migration in the United States. I'm focusing on unauthorized migrants because I think that they provide a really helpful lens to think about membership and belonging in a democratic society. I'm then going to spend a bit of time talking about the status model and the participation model as it is showing up in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I will open it up for Q&A, and I really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with immigration law, so pardon me if this is all old hat to you, but I just want to start by giving a really basic introduction to unauthorized migration. And first, just to talk about the two ways that individuals can become unauthorized migrants in the United States. The first is probably what most of you have in mind when you think about unauthorized migration, and that's people who crossed a border without authorization. In immigration law, we refer to this as people who entered without inspection, meaning that they did not enter the United States through a formal port of entry. So as many of you travel around the world and come back to the US, you enter through JFK or LAX, and there are officers from CBP who scan your passport and admit you. If you're a non-citizen, you go through the same process, maybe a different line, but the idea is that there is an immigration officer who admits you. If you entered without inspection, you did not go through that process. You may have crossed through a desert, you may have crossed the Rio Grande, but there the idea is that there's no formal record of your admission to the entry into the United States. The second way that people become unauthorized is that they overstay a non-immigrant visa. So non-immigrant visas are granted to people to enter the United States for a very specific purpose for a specified period of time. So for example, students are a great example. If you have a student visa, you are admitted to pursue a particular educational program for say 4 years if it's like a bachelor's degree. At the end of those 4 years, if you do not leave the United States, you have become an unauthorized migrant if you don't find some other visa to stay on. And so that is what is referred to as being a visa overstayer. And recent research suggests that anywhere between 50% to 60% of the unauthorized migrant population is in that status as a result of overstaying a non-immigrant visa. Now, I want to put the unauthorized migrant population in the broader context of the foreign-born population in the United States. So as you can see from this slide, we've got about 14% of the US population is foreign-born. That accounts for about 44 million individuals. And then as we'll see in the next slide, when we break down that foreign-born population, we see a mix. And so what we will see here is that 45% of the of the foreign-born population are naturalized citizens, meaning that while they were born outside of the United States, they did naturalize and become citizens. 27% are lawful permanent residents, LPRs, but you might be more familiar with the term green card holders. So these are individuals who have been granted permission to enter and reside in the United States indefinitely. 23% of the foreign-born population are unauthorized migrants, and that 23% ends up being around 11 million individuals. And then we have 5% who are non-immigrants. Again, that category like the students and other people who are granted permission to enter for a specified purpose for a limited period of time. Now, another thing to keep in mind is the long-term residence of the unauthorized migrant population in the United States. 62% of this population have lived in the United States for at least 10 years. Another interesting statistic here is that 21% of the unauthorized migrant population have lived in the United States for at least 20 years. So we're talking about a well-settled population. It is not transitory. And so you may be wondering, how is it that the United States could have such a significant unauthorized migrant population? And while I have to say that that could be the topic of a semester-long seminar, let me provide you with at least one example that demonstrates at least the role that US law plays in either acknowledging or ignoring sort of this country's historic reliance on low-wage foreign workers, and the impact that the law's recognition or ignoring of this sort of reality has on the size of the unauthorized migrant population in the United States. So the United States has had a historic reliance on low-wage foreign workers. It has been very sort of prominent within agriculture, but it's also existed in other industries. So for example, the large expansion of agriculture within the Southwest was heavily dependent on low-wage foreign workers. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad, similarly with Chinese workers. And so this isn't anything new. And between 1942 and 1964, the United States had a temporary worker program named the Bracero Program. And while this program had a lot of critiques and critics of it because of the way the workers were treated, what I want to focus on is at least the legal recognition of the workers who were coming here to do agricultural temporary work. And so while that program was operating, an average of 200,000 workers from Mexico were coming every year to work in agriculture in the United States. And they were taking part in what is referred to as circular migration. They would come to the United States, work for a season or two, return to Mexico, and come back at a later point in time in the United States. They were not settling permanently in the United States. And what's interesting is that in 1965, with the enactment of the 1965 Immigration Act, that changed significantly. Now, the 1965 Act is known as a very important piece of immigration legislation because it eliminated the national origin quotas. And I'm happy to say more about that during the Q&A if anybody has questions. But it was really an important piece of sort of civil rights legislation within the immigration world. It said we will no longer determine how many people can come based on what country you're from and what that size of that population was like in the United States, but we're going to equalize the quotas for all countries around the world for the most part. But what that act also did was there were three pieces of it or aspects of it that had very significant impacts on migration from Mexico and subsequently from Central America. So the first was that it created numerical restrictions for the Western Hemisphere. Despite the operation of the national origin quotas, the Western Hemisphere had always been exempt. There was a good neighbor policy. There was the recognition of the long-standing and important migration of workers from Mexico. And so the Western Hemisphere had just been exempt. Well, with the 1965 Act and the move towards equality, the Western Hemisphere was now subject to numerical restrictions. And at that point, the restriction was 120,000 individuals for the entire Western Hemisphere. So Canada, Mexico, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. Now you can imagine that might not seem to be sufficient given that on average during the Bracero program, we had 200,000 Mexican workers coming to the United States every year. The second piece is that the quota was, the sort of numerical restrictions were for individuals coming as green card holders. And there were not very many opportunities for individuals who were sort of low wage foreign workers to be coming as green card holders. The main paths were family-based and employment-based, and the employment-based categories were primarily for higher skilled workers. And at that point in time, there wasn't a significant population in America and Mexican either naturalized citizens from Mexico that would have been utilizing the family-based category. Secondly, or third, there was no new program instituted for temporary labor. So the Bracero program was not replaced. It was not morphed into some other guest worker program. And it would be a number of years before we got sort of the H-2A program that we have today. And even today, many employers complain about the bureaucracy and some of the other requirements attached to it. So all of this is to say that you can imagine when the 1965 Act was enacted, getting rid of the temporary, not adopting a new temporary worker program, the ending of the Bracero program, the new numerical restrictions. You might imagine what happened. So if you look at this slide, you can see the first vertical bar is the 1965 Act, where we see the impacts that I just mentioned. And from this graph, you can see a couple of interesting things. First, the red line is the line of temporary workers. The yellow line is the line for unauthorized migrants, and the gray line are the LPRs or green card holders. And what you see is that as we get close to 1965, as the Bracero program is winding down, temporary workers goes to zero, but at the same time, we're seeing an increase in the number of unauthorized migrants. It's as they switch places. And so essentially, individuals who had been working lawfully in the United States through the Bracero program, who continued to work in the United States after 1965, became unauthorized migrants. Now, employers were still eager to hire these foreign workers based on their conclusion, the employers, that there weren't sufficient US workers available. These employers had lobbied Congress to sort of either extend the Bracero program or come up with something new, but they were not successful. And they failed in part due to the lobbying efforts on behalf of American labor interests. And so while there's some other figures and trends that you can see on this chart, I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A. The main point here to recognize is the role of law in recognizing either the need for or the recognition of employers' claim that there's a need for foreign workers. And when the law does recognize that, we don't see a significant unauthorized migrant population. When the law does not recognize that need, the workers don't disappear, the employers don't stop hiring them, but their legal status shifts and they do become unauthorized migrants. And as we also saw post-65, increases in immigration enforcement strategies meant that we reduced the amount of circular migration that was happening, and so the unauthorized migrant population became more settled. And that's how we can get 62% of the unauthorized migrant population having resided in the United States for at least 10 years. So while temporary foreign workers and subsequent unauthorized migrants were initially concentrated in agriculture, unauthorized migrants now work in a variety of industries in the United States. And tonight I want to focus on their employment as essential workers. And so within the agricultural industry, it is estimated that anywhere between 50 to 75% of farm workers are unauthorized migrants. And so that works out to about 1.5 million individual unauthorized migrants who are working as farm workers. We also have around 280,000 unauthorized migrants who are working as healthcare workers. They are working as nursing assistants, as home health aides, as medical assistants, or as housekeepers keeping the medical facilities and the hospitals clean, which as we know today is an even more important task. And during this time of stay-at-home orders, we've also come to see the great importance of delivery workers. And we have about 25,000 unauthorized migrants working as delivery workers who are delivering groceries and food from restaurants. And to provide some more context about unauthorized migrants as essential workers, I want to introduce you to Rosalia. Rosalia is a farm worker in Salinas, California. She's the mother of 5 children, and they are her biggest pride. She gets up at 4:30 every morning to ensure that she's at work by 6 a.m. And she does a variety of jobs, including moving plants and picking blackberries. And she noted that one of the hardest parts of her job are dealing with the thorns of the blackberries. And as someone who grew up with a lot of blackberry bushes in her yard, I can attest to the challenges, to say the least, that blackberry thorns present. And Rosalia is undocumented. And despite her essential work in ensuring that we have the food that we desire and need at this moment, due to her immigration status, she is actually ineligible for relief from the federal government that's been provided in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet the state of California is actually providing COVID-19 relief to undocumented migrants like Rosalia. So the federal approach reflects what I'm referring to here as the status model of membership, and the California approach is reflective of the participation model. And so let me walk you through one aspect of the federal COVID-19 response, the relief package that's been provided that represents the status model. So as I'm sure you're all aware of, one aspect of the CARES Act was to provide the economic impact payments. And the purpose of these payments is to reduce the financial burden and sort of impact that individuals are facing as a result of the pandemic, and also to help stimulate the economy. And these payments allow for individuals to get up to $1,200 and $500 per child. In order to receive these funds, you have to be a US citizen, a green card holder, or not a resident alien. And that's a technical term, and a resident alien is essentially a non-citizen who satisfies the substantial presence test. Yet unauthorized migrants, regardless of their length of residence in the United States, and if they could otherwise satisfy the substantial presence test, are not eligible for these payments. Additionally, individuals who would otherwise be eligible but are married to an unauthorized migrant and they file jointly with that unauthorized migrant are ineligible for the payments. And similarly, individuals who are otherwise eligible but claim an unauthorized migrant child as a dependent on their taxes are also ineligible for these payments. And so within this model, sort of we the people, the members of society who are deemed the members who are going to be entitled to and in need of the economic support are individuals identified based on their status, their citizenship status, and their immigration status. And California has taken a different approach. So California has sort of put in place what is known as the Disaster Relief Fund. And this Disaster Relief Fund reflects a different model of membership. So it is a public-private partnership. It will provide $500 per individual and up to $1,000 per household. This fund was created specifically to fill the gap that was left by the CARES Act and other federal programs. These funds are actually available to unauthorized migrants precisely because they were left out of the other programs and because they are viewed as members of the community based on their work, often as essential workers in the state of California. This quote from Lorraine Powell Jobs, who is the founder and president of the Emerson Collective, which is a contributor to the Disaster Relief Fund, explained that during this moment of crisis, undocumented immigrants are risking their own health on behalf of the rest of us. She mentions that they're saving our lives as healthcare workers and that they're growing the food that we depend on. She explains that with the federal government in so many states failing to provide undocumented immigrants the economic and health supports all Americans deserve, that she hopes that individuals will contribute to this fund. And I think most interestingly, she says, she asked that for people to join them in providing the emergency relief these members of our community need to weather this challenging time. So again, she's identifying unauthorized migrants as Americans and members of our community, and she's tying or basing that membership on the work that they're doing, the participation in our community as essential workers. And so in many ways, you can think of the participation model as viewing skin in the game as the basis for membership. Now, these are just two examples of the various ways that status and participation models show up in policymaking and in public discourse. Through our discussion tonight, it's my hope that you not only have gained or will gain a better understanding of why and how we have an unauthorized migrant population of 11 million individuals here in the United States, but also about the various ways that we can think about membership. One approach is to focus on status, either citizenship status or immigration status. And another approach looks to an individual's participation within the communities in which they reside. An approach that focuses on status can be under-inclusive of the large numbers of people who are active participants in American society. Now, which model is most appropriate will vary based on the circumstances. This slide here provides a few questions that I hope will help you think through which approach is most appropriate for the various circumstances in which you might be thinking about membership in American society. So for example, what are the goals of the organization or the entity, the community? Is status relevant to achieving those goals? How does one obtain status? Who participates? Who contributes? Who is present? And again, all of these questions are going to play out differently in different contexts, but it's just the fact that we should be thinking about these things in terms of trying to identify who are the individuals who we view as members and who are the people, therefore, that should be entitled to the various rights, opportunities, and responsibilities that membership within a community entails. So I'm going to end there, and I just want to say thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Banks. And I have a couple questions to get started with over here. And please continue to put your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function and we'll call on you and open it up. So my first question for you, Professor Banks, is do you think COVID-19 will cause more people to see unauthorized migrants as essential to our economy?
So I think it's an interesting question. I know that there are a number of immigrants' rights organizations that have campaigns that are sort of highlighting this point. I think overall, I think Americans are perhaps gaining more appreciation for individuals that do this sort of essential work. You know, we've seen cities sort of having dedicated times to clap and applaud for healthcare workers. I think, people are putting signs in their yards to thank delivery workers. And to the extent that people understand that unauthorized migrants are part of that essential worker group, I think it can help people understand the role that they're playing in American society.
Thank you. Are other states or states other than California providing the same type of relief?
Not that I'm aware of yet. There have been different organizations that have been working with states like New Jersey to try to see if there is something they could do, but no other state has enacted anything akin to what California has done.
Great. Now, how has the status or participation dichotomy affect someone who is elderly or has elderly parents or grandparents that are in neither category and not working or have no status?
So would this be sort of, you thinking unauthorized migrants who might be elderly?
Feel free to chime in too, Victoria.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Professor Banks. Yes, that's my question. What about someone who is unauthorized migrant who of course doesn't have status because they're unauthorized, but they also are not part of the participation because they're elderly or otherwise infirm? Are they just invisible in the system, or how does this affect them?
Yeah, no, so this is a great question. And sort of one of the challenges I had with coming up with this presentation is that I think there are also some additional models of participation different models of membership, because I think just as you raised, depending on how we define participation, it can be exclusive of individuals who've been long-term residents here as well. And we might be concerned about that exclusion. So in the COVID-19 context, there has been no sort of recognition of unauthorized migrants who aren't essential workers as also deserving of support from governments or states in terms of relief. The emphasis really has been on, these individuals are really contributing to our society and contributing to our society at this very challenging moment, and that ought to be recognized. But I think you raise a very important point, and in another piece that I'm working on, I'm actually thinking of the role that presence, just simple presence, has in terms of thinking about membership, because US immigration law has a long history of treating long-term presence in the country as sufficient for membership status.
Fantastic. Now, how do you think the migrant issue will play into the 2020 political campaign?
Oh, I think it's going to play a very big role, just as it did in 2016. And so I think that we can see a little bit of that peaking up at various moments, especially pre-COVID-19, that immigration was going to play an important, I think at least it will be an issue that candidates will talk about a lot. And I think the reason they will talk about it a lot is because they will view it as something that will be of interest to voters. Now, what will be interesting is the extent to which the economy will play just a much larger role in the 2020 election. But one interesting point there is whether or not immigrants and unauthorized migrants in particular will be used or sort of talked about to help explain some of the economic challenges that the country is having, or whether or not immigration will be viewed in the way it was in 2016, more in terms of public safety and national security, and the economy will be treated as a separate issue.
Fantastic. How are the estimates of unauthorized migrants in each job category derived?
So individual demographers will look at the data from the census. So there's the American Community Survey that comes out. I think that's every year, whereas the census is every 10 years. And they sort of triangulate the data from there about who's working in what category, which professions, the numbers of individuals who have various statuses, and they derive the numbers that way. And there's another since post-DACA, that's been another way in which individuals who, again, don't have legal status, immigration status, and are working in different areas, the government has access to that information as well.
That actually leads into our next question very well. So where do DACA recipients fit into this dichotomy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Really in the middle, and I think the reason that DACA was extended to them in terms of a grant of prosecutorial discretion was because of the view of them being members based on participation. But the president, through executive action, is limited in the kinds of relief that can be provided in the immigration sphere. So the president cannot grant status just sort of on hold to people. That's something that can only happen through congressional action. And so what DACA did is it said, well, we promise not to deport individuals who apply and are accepted for 2 years. And the Immigration and Nationality Act already provided that when someone gets deferred action, they can also get work authorization. So I think DACA is an interesting example of either sort of a participation or presence understanding of membership. And that's how they were able to at least get that reprieve from deportation.
These are great questions, everyone. Keep submitting them. Where do persons involved in removal proceedings with employment authorization fit into your model?
So if they have essentially a green card or an H-1B, so they already have a legal status, I think it's sort of in the status model that they would have been somebody who had immigration status, but for one reason or another ended up in deportation or removal proceedings because they ran afoul of one of the deportation grounds. And there you can think about membership perhaps in a contractual way for non-citizens, particularly green card holders, which is that we grant you permission to reside here indefinitely, as long as you fit within these guidelines. So you promise to do these things and you can have this status. The minute that you step out of that or you violate one of those rules, then we can remove you. And so it is really focusing on that idea of status as being, and the conditions of status to determine who's a member. And there's some very interesting work about whether or not long-term green card holders, whether some of the deportation offenses that exist, so for example, shoplifting and other sort of what people might refer to as minor crimes with relatively short, even the criminal justice system may not give them jail time. They might have a minor fine. They could still find themselves deportable. And so really does raise interesting questions about their membership and whether it is really contingent and how vulnerable is it.
Great. If they retain citizenship in their home country, are they eligible to receive a relief from that country?
So it would depend on the rules in that country. Sometimes there might be a residence requirement. If it's just a citizenship status requirement, then that would be sufficient. So for example, in the United States, in order to get the CARES Act relief, you had to essentially file taxes in the United States. There are some ways that if you were someone who wasn't required to file, you didn't have to, you would still be eligible for the relief. And so other countries might have similar kinds of conditions upon access to their relief. And again, thinking about wanting to assist individuals who are physically present in the country at the time that COVID-19 is taking place.
Great. And then I know you sort of touched on this, but are there additional ways to think about membership in a democratic society?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are, and as I mentioned, sort of I hinted on the idea of presence. So soon after the national origin quotas were instituted, which really shifted who was able to migrate to the United States, there were large numbers of individuals who ended up evading those national origin quotas and essentially were unauthorized in the United States. And for various reasons, Congress enacted something called the Registry Act. And it allowed individuals who didn't have, basically couldn't provide a certificate of arrival. It allowed them to obtain one by presenting themselves to the government officials, saying that they'd been present since a particular moment in time, that they hadn't engaged in certain kinds of behavior, and they would be then granted lawful status, immigration status in the United States. And really that was just about being present. And being present for a specific period of time. You'll notice our naturalization laws require someone generally to be present for 5 years before they're eligible for naturalization. So there are a lot of ways in which I think our immigration and citizenship law privilege long-term residents. And this idea that once someone has physically resided here for a specified period of time, that they've become ours. They are a member. So I think that that can be another way to think about membership as well.
Great. Why does it appear that both political parties are content with the current status quo?
Good question. I think if I had the answer to that, I'd have a different job. But I think there's just a lot of, I would say, complicated and intersecting interests that come into play when we think about immigration policy. As I always tell my students, there is no sort of one line or one approach that's the Republican approach or the Democratic approach or the liberal approach or the conservative approach. It all varies depending, are we talking about employers versus employees? Are we talking about asylum law? Are we talking about, deportation? It all, and every, individuals and groups within each of those categories can all have different opinions about the labor aspect of it versus the deportation part of it. And so I just think in many ways, there's just a lot of gridlock in terms of the politics of what to do about immigration. I actually think there's a lot more agreement on the policy side of things, but it's the politics of how to get it done. I show a documentary to my students every year about the 2007 period where immigration reform looked like it might actually make it through Congress. And Eric Cantor, at one of the high moments of when they were getting things together, was primaried and lost his reelection bid. He was Speaker of the House. And the person who ousted him had made immigration a really big topic in the election. And so there was a real sense at that moment that members of Congress felt like, oh, I'm afraid to do anything on immigration. I don't want to be primaried. I don't want to lose my seat. And so I think the politics of this are very challenging. And I'm not sure what can be done to shift that.
Can you share with us the name of the documentary?
I the minute I said it, I was like, I will look it up and I will put it in the chat before.
And we're sending an email out tomorrow. Maybe we'll
okay. Then I'll send it to Hallie and put it in the to put it in the and I can even provide a link to it.
Perfect. Thank you. Is it possible that the California Disaster Relief Fund will lead to a backlash against unauthorized migrants?
It's always possible. And again, it depends on how things get framed by individuals who either are concerned about the creation of this fund and whether or not that sort of framing gets sticky. Does it get sticky? And so the concern there would be that there are a lot of sort of American citizens who are suffering right now. There's just a lot of suffering right now. And to the extent that individuals feel like their suffering hasn't been adequately addressed, and there is a sense that money that could have otherwise gone to them is going to some other group, that could be the basis for some sort of backlash. And again, it all comes back to whether or not unauthorized migrants are viewed as members, because if they're not viewed as members, then it'll seem like, well, they got that money and I did, and it should have come to me. But if you see everybody as a member of the society, and we have to figure out, who gets what, and, you may have gotten more from the CARES Act than they got through the Disaster Relief Fund. So it doesn't seem as though something that should give rise to backlash. But that's why I said, I think it really will depend on how it gets framed by various actors within society and how it gets talked about.
Definitely. These are great questions, everyone. Feel free to keep sending them. Is there a specific charity to whom we could donate to these unauthorized migrant essential workers that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of, well, I know California is taking donations from the public for the Disaster Relief Fund, and I can do a little bit of digging, and maybe I can send Hallie something if I can find anything about that, because I understand the question to be specifically about going to essential workers, and that's what I'm not sure of right now.
Okay, great. Do we have any last questions before we wrap up here tonight? All right. Well, here's one more. Can a state enact policies and laws to change one's position from participant to status?
So really interesting question. So in terms of providing actual sort of citizenship or immigration status, no. But there are ways that states can make status less important in terms of, or at least not decisive or dispositive, in terms of the ways in which an individual gets to participate within a society. So for example, a state like California saying you're eligible for these funds, but we don't care about your immigration status is one approach, because California can't grant anybody an immigration status because that's a federal prerogative.
Great. Anyone else before we wrap up? Okay, I'll have Angela go to the next slide.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining us tonight. We're so thrilled to be able to engage with you even during this time. Thank you, Professor Banks, for this wonderful discussion and leading us through these wonderful topics. And up here, we have 2 upcoming events that we hope that you're able to join us at. We have next week on Thursday at noon, an alumni update with Dean Doug Sylvester. And then Wednesday, May 27th at noon, bankruptcy and COVID with Professor Laura Cordes. So we hope that you guys are able to join us moving forward, and we hope you're at home staying safe and healthy. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you.